anatomical comparisons, a cross-species analysis of the brown rat and grass frog.
The first organism that we'll be looking at today is the Rattus norvegicus, also known as the brown rat. It belongs to kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Rodentia, family Muridae, genus Rattus, and species are norvegicus. Some of its biotic factors include its ability to coexist with other rodents and the fact that it has many predators. Its abiotic factors include having a wide temperature range in which it can thrive in, and the fact that it needs a water source. Its role in a typical food chain is consumer and prey, and it has polygynandrous mating. Its most common ancestor are the tetrapods from about 340 million years ago, point of origin.
The studied species of frog belongs to the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, and class Amphibia, meaning it's a vertebrate and an amphibian. It falls under the order Anura, which involves frogs and toads, and the family Ranidae, which includes true frogs. Its genus is Rana, and its species is R. ferreri. Rana ferreri coexists with other aquatic organisms, meaning it interacts with various species within its habitat, including prey, predators, and competitors. This frog also depends on bodies of water and humid, warm environments to survive, as amphibians require moisture to regulate their body functions and facilitate reproduction. The species of frog serves as both a consumer and prey, meaning it feeds on smaller organisms such as insects, while also being a food source for larger predators. In regards to mating behavior, the species also follows a polygynandrous mating system. The most recent common ancestor of R. ferreri and other tetrapods dates back to approximately 340 million years ago. Here's the phylogenetic tree that relates these two species.
The first system we're going to be talking about is the digestive system, more specifically looking at the rats. The first organ we're going to be looking at is the stomach. The stomach is responsible for breaking down food into a semi-liquid. This is done by using gastric acids and enzymes. This semi-liquid will eventually be passed down to the small intestine. The small intestine is the primary site of nutrient absorption. It specifically targets macromolecules like carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Next, we have the large intestine. The large intestine mainly absorbs water and electrolytes from the remaining undigested food. From there, we have the liver. The liver detoxifies harmful substances that may have been ingested. From there, it also produces bile, which helps in fat digestion. Next, we'll be looking at the pancreas. The pancreas has both digestive and endocrine functions. It releases digestive enzymes like amylase and lipase to break down carbohydrates and fat. The main part it plays when it comes to rats is producing insulin, which helps regulate blood sugar level. Next part of the system we're going to be looking at is the mouth. This is where digestion starts at, and it's what allows the rat to consume food. From there, it goes down to the esophagus. This is what connects the mouth to the stomach, and it allows for the food to eventually reach the stomach where it'll be digested. The esophagus has what's called sphincter muscles within inside of it. This prevents food that may or may not be fully digested from coming back up into the mouth, also known as acid reflux. It also prevents air from entering when eating or heavy breathing is happening. There are multiple sphincter muscles within the rat, also known as the pyloric sphincter and anal sphincter. Both of these have different roles to play that do not relate to digestion. The pyloric sphincter controls how much is emptied into the small intestine, and the anal sphincter helps control defecation. The final piece to this system is the salivary gland. This helps produce saliva, which in return moistens and softens the food. It also contains enzymes that will start breaking down the food before it reaches the stomach.
The system for the frog follows a very similar path. The food travels from the mouth to the esophagus, to the stomach, to then the small intestine. A lack of a feature here is the salivary gland, because frogs have a much simpler digestive system that's not based on preferences or taste. The food then goes to the large intestine. A lack of a sphincter is seen here, as frogs, just mentioned, have simpler digestive systems and don't necessarily have problems like acid reflux and don't need to worry about food regurgitating. There's also the gallbladder that stores bile produced by the liver, and there's the pancreas that regulates blood sugar the same way it does in the frog.
The next system is the nervous system. As for the rat, the main control center of the body is the brain. This is responsible for most automatic functions like breathing and heart rate, as well as conscious activities like movement and thinking. As part of the brain, it has a brainstem, and on this brainstem is the cranial nerves. This is a set of 12 nerves, and they're responsible for most sensory and motor functions. This includes the 5 senses. From there, you have the spinal cord. This is the main communication pathway between the brain and the rest of the body. This carries all sensory information to the brain, and it involves a lot of reflex actions and occurs without direct brain involvement. On top of that, there are the spinal nerves, and these nerves branch from the spinal cord, and it allows for movement and sensory feedback. For example, this is how a rat might notice and feel pain and or heat or temperature changes.
The nervous system of the frog consists of the same 4 parts: a brain, cranial nerves, a spinal cord, and spinal nerves. The main difference, however, is the presence of only 10 pairs of cranial nerves, as a frog has less sensory reception than a rat.
The next system that we will be going over are the excretory and reproductive systems. First of all, with the excretory system in a rat, one of the first functions we look at are the kidneys, which filter waste from blood, regulate fluids, and produce urine. Then we have the ureters, which lead out from the kidneys and transport urine to the bladder via muscular contractions. The bladder stores urine temporarily before excretion, and then the urine eventually excretes out from the urethra. Since our group was given a male rat for dissection, we'll be looking at the male reproductive system and its parts. First, we have the testes, which produce sperm and secrete hormones, primarily testosterone. Then we have the vas deferens, which transports sperm from the epididymis to the urethra during ejaculation. Then the epididymis stores and matures sperm after they are produced in the testes, and the prostate also secretes fluid that nourishes and protects the sperm. The penis is used during sex for reproduction, and then the scrotum eventually houses and regulates the testes.
Dissection of the frog yielded pretty similar structures. However, one key difference was with the cloaca, which serves as the exit point for waste, and in terms of the frog, is the rectum of sorts. Now, alluding to question 5 in the protocol, some frog species have developed to keep embryos in the skin of their back, as this protects such embryos from predators and harsh environmental conditions. This adaptation increases the likelihood that more offspring will survive and contribute to the ecosystem around them, leading to the genes for this protective behavior being passed on to subsequent offspring. Over time, frogs with this reproductive strategy were naturally selected because they had higher reproductive success compared to those that laid their eggs unprotected in water.
Next up, we have the circulatory system. First off, we're going to look at the chambers of the heart. This will also indicate how the blood flows through the body. Starting off, we have the right atrium. This receives deoxygenated blood from the body. Then we have the right ventricle. This pumps the deoxygenated blood to the lungs for oxygenation. The left atrium receives this blood from the lungs, then transports it to the left ventricle, which pumps the oxygen-rich blood to the rest of the body. Now, this is not done solely through the heart. It also uses a lot of different blood vessels to help carry this blood around the body. The 3 main important ones are the arteries, the capillaries, and the veins. The arteries carry blood away from the heart. The capillaries allow for gas exchange through blood and tissues, and the veins carry the blood back to the heart. Now, within the blood, there are red blood cells, white blood cells, and plasma. The red blood cells transport oxygen, the white blood cells defend the body against pathogens, and the plasma carries nutrients, hormones, and waste products. Another way of putting this is through pulmonary circulation, which moves the deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs and then returns the oxygenated blood. Another way is the systemic circulation, which delivers oxygenated blood to the body and returns deoxygenated blood to the heart.
While the circulatory system of the frog also has a heart, its structure differs significantly. Having only 3 chambers, there are 2 atriums and 1 ventricle. The right atrium still collects blood from the body, and the left atrium still collects blood from the lungs, but a single ventricle is shared between the two to pump the blood to either the lungs or the body.
The next system that we'll be looking at is the respiratory system. First, let's look at the nasal cavity from which air enters, where air is filtered, moistened, and warmed before it enters the lungs. Then, the air goes to the pharynx, larynx, and trachea. The pharynx is a passageway for air from the nasal cavity to the larynx and also serves as a pathway for food. The larynx contains the vocal cords and is responsible for sound production and protecting the trachea during swallowing. And the trachea is a tube that carries air from the larynx to the bronchi and is reinforced with cartilage in order to keep it open. The epiglottis is also crucial as it covers the trachea during swallowing to prevent food from entering the airway. The bronchi branch off from the trachea and direct air into each lung. The alveoli, similar in function to humans' alveoli, are tiny air sacs in the lungs where gas exchange occurs, typically involving oxygen and carbon dioxide. Finally, the diaphragm is located in the thoracic cavity and is a muscle that contracts and relaxes to enable breathing.
The pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, alveoli, and nasal cavity were similarly identified, each serving a similar function. However, a key difference lies in how the frog respirates. While both studied species utilize pulmonary respiration, where simple lungs are utilized for gas exchange, frogs can utilize cutaneous respiration or skin breathing. Frogs can absorb oxygen and release carbon dioxide directly through their moist skin. This is especially important when they're underwater, as they can continue to exchange gases without having to utilize their lungs.
The final system that we will be analyzing is the locomotion system. Now first, when looking at the locomotion system of a rat, we will look at its skeleton. First, the axial skeleton is composed of the skull, spine, and rib cage, and it supports the central axis of the body and protects vital organs like the brain and the heart. Then the appendicular skeleton involves the appendages and limbs that are attached to the central axis, or axial skeleton. It facilitates movement and supports body weight during movement. Next, the other parts of the locomotion system are cartilage, which is a flexible connective tissue that provides cushioning at joints, reduces friction, and supports structures like the nose, ears, and trachea. Then there are the joints, which are the points where two or more bones meet and allow for movement and flexibility between those points. The tendon is a fibrous tissue that connects muscle to bones, and tendons also transmit the force generated by muscles to move the bones. Finally, we have the ligament, which is a fibrous connective tissue that connects bones to other bones, and muscles, which are tissues that contract and relax to produce movement, maintain posture, and generate heat.
The locomotion system of the frog species that was dissected yielded very similar structures. Adding on to the list of aforementioned structures, there's also skeletal muscle, which is voluntary movement enabling muscle that's connected to bones, cardiac muscle, which is involuntary and allows the heart to contract and pump out blood, and smooth muscle, which is involuntary and allows for digestion. Some common movements made possible by these mechanisms are swimming and hopping.
Next, we will be comparing the anatomies of the brown rat and the grass frog. There are many similarities between their anatomies, including the digestive, nervous, and reproductive and excretory system. Both have a mouth, esophagus, stomach, small and large intestine, liver, and pancreas. In the nervous system, they both share a brain, spinal cord, cranial and spinal nerves, and reflexes, as many animals do. Finally, with the reproductive and excretory system, both have kidneys, ureters, and a bladder.
There's also the circulatory system, respiratory system, and locomotion systems, which exhibit pretty strong similarities between the two species. For starters, both species have a closed system with a heart, arteries, veins, and capillaries. Both have a nasal cavity, lungs, diaphragm-like muscles, and both have a skeletal muscles, and supporting tissues.
As alluded to before, there are traits that are unique to each organism. In terms of the digestive system, rats have a more complex system suited for a wider variety of foods, whereas for frogs, it's shorter and suited for a diet based on insects. In terms of reproduction, rats use internal fertilization, where a male and a female reproduce and the female carries a child. For frogs, they practice external fertilization, where they lay eggs that will eventually turn into tadpoles and undergo metamorphosis. Their circulatory systems also differ in terms of the heart chambers. Rats have a 4-chambered heart, while frogs have a 3-chambered heart. In terms of respiration, rats breathe through their lungs and don't rely on skin for exchanges, while frogs can breathe through their skin, which make them more suited to aquatic environments. For locomotion, rats are adapted for running and climbing, while frogs are more adapted for jumping and swimming.
Based off of our observations, we can start to make some predictions. The first one is taking a look at the transition from amphibians to mammals. As we know, there is a common ancestor of tetrapods, and at some point there was a branch. This branch shows that rats moved away from amphibians, reducing their dependency on water. Now, this very well could have been caused by environmental pressures, which is one of our predictions. This could look like a change in environments, and this may have led to features such as hair and more complex respiratory and circulatory systems. On top of that, there is predation and coevolution. As mammals evolved higher metabolic rates, the frogs adapted to nocturnal and cryptic lifestyles. Now moving on to the reflection questions. The first one, rats are placed in the phylum Chordata. This means that they share a common ancestor with most lineages of rodents, but more specifically with the placental mammal lineage. For number 2, the group Aminion. It relates to rats' anatomy as the embryo develops internally versus in the eggs. As for the third one, there are some rodents that do not have tails or that are very short, such as capybaras and guinea pigs. Others are tailless, like primates, sloth, and koalas.
And for the fourth question, we will be looking at burrowing and nesting rats, who are often the ones who benefit most from natural selection due to their behavior. They tend to hide away their young away from open predators, which increases their survivability rate and therefore increases the population of their species in general. And then for the last question, since rats have such a short gestation period, that means they've evolved in such a way that they're able to thrive in environments where the only way for the entire population to survive is through rapid reproduction.
For question 1, the absence of a tail in both frogs and humans is attributable to convergent evolution, which is especially true when understanding that the chordate phylogenetic tree involves humans and frogs both descending from a common ancestor with a tail. For questions 2 and 3, which are combined, when you consider the fact that several tetrapods are limbless, the name tetrapods is more closely related to evolutionary relationships rather than the current presence of 4 limbs in a particular species. Tetrapods can thus be considered species that descended from an ancestor with 4 limbs.
The origin of apidian tetrapods is likely due to convergent evolution as well. These species descended from 4-limbed ancestors but eventually lost the trait over time, likely due to the different selective pressures they faced. For question 5, this species has a longer gestation period. This suggests that it is adapted for lower rates of reproduction. However, it likely compensates with higher rates of offspring survival.
Finally, we have our conclusion. Through our observations, we found that most of the systems had similar organs, such as having a heart that pumps blood or having limbs that are meant for movement. Now, there were some minor differences, such as having a 3-chambered heart versus a 4. These features show evidence for the most common ancestor we presented and how environmental pressure influenced evolutionary change.
And here are our references.